Imagine standing in a grand palace where gold gleams under torchlight, but the floor beneath your feet is still sticky with blood. You hear music, laughter, and the faint crack of a whip echoing from the royal chambers. Behind those silk curtains sits a prince, young, handsome, and adored by his court. Yet his pleasures are soaked in cruelty. Tonight, history's most sadistic heir begins his ritual of terror. Centuries ago, in the shadow of Central Asia's brutal steppes, the legacy of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, carved an empire built on both brilliance and blood. His descendants inherited not only his throne, but also his thirst for power, wrapped in divine justification and ceremonial violence. Among these heirs emerged one prince, whose cruelty eclipsed all others. Born into silk and conquest, he was taught that fear was stronger than loyalty, that the spilling of blood was an art of control. Chroniclers of the time whispered his name in dread, recording stories too grotesque for royal archives. To his people, he was both god and demon, a ruler who turned devotion into despair and justice into spectacle. His reign did not merely rule bodies, it devoured souls. What drove a child of empire to become a master of ritualized pain? Tonight, we unearth the story of the most sadistic prince in history, and the dynasty that fed his darkness. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts below. It really helps us bring you more tales from the hidden corners of history. The prince was born under a blood-red moon, or so the court astrologers claimed, their whispered warnings lingering like smoke in the grand halls of his family palace. From the moment he first opened his eyes, attendants noted the sharpness in his gaze, a cruel intelligence that seemed far beyond the curiosity of a child. His earliest playthings were not toys, but objects of power and fear, small animals, whose cries echoed through the marble corridors, carefully observed for reactions, lessons in dominance etched into his young mind. By the age of 7, he had already learned to command silence and terror alike. Servants flinched at his approach. Even his own tutors spoke in measured tones, knowing that the wrong word or gesture could invite a punishment so swift it left marks both on flesh and reputation. As he grew, the rituals of blood and obedience became a private obsession, first in games of shadow and fear, then in subtle trials that tested loyalty and shattered innocence. Nobles whispered in hushed gatherings of the prince's fascination with ceremonial suffering, of how he would watch from hidden balconies as captives were brought to the palace for inspection, and yet never intervened, allowing the human body to become an instrument of quiet, creeping horror. Even within his family, there were those who feared to correct him, sensing that the boy's pleasure was an echo of some ancient cruelty embedded deep within the dynasty's veins, a legacy of conquest and bloodshed that had been passed down from Timur himself. His education, though exemplary in language, mathematics, and strategy, was inseparable from this darker curriculum. Lessons in statecraft were mirrored by lessons in manipulation, observation, and control. Every corridor he walked seemed to hum with potential terror, every shadow a reminder that power was inseparable from suffering. Yet, to outsiders and visiting dignitaries, he appeared charming, intelligent, and impossibly graceful. A prince, poised for greatness, masking a sinister obsession that would one day redefine cruelty. The court physicians murmured of nightmares, of servants who claimed to hear laughter that was not a child's, laughter that carried the weight of human suffering. Even as he played among his peers, He measured reactions with the precision of a scholar, noting every flinch, every gasp, every involuntary tremor, cataloging human weakness as though it were an academic pursuit. The prince's mother, herself a woman of fierce intelligence and political acumen, tried to temper his darker inclinations, offering lessons in mercy and restraint, yet found that her words fell upon an impermeable mind, a heart already attuned to the rhythms of fear. Nights in the palace were filled with hushed rituals, small animals sacrificed in hidden chambers, the blood carefully observed, recorded, and studied. Servants who stumbled upon these scenes disappeared without trace. Each act, however minor, was a step toward mastery over life and death, a rehearsal for larger displays of power. Outside the palace walls, the streets of the city pulsed with life, unaware of the darkness growing in the marble halls above. Traders, craftsmen, and peasants lived in a fragile rhythm of commerce and celebration, ignorant that the young prince, poised to inherit unimaginable power, was silently cataloging the fragility of human existence. And yet, despite his growing cruelty, he understood diplomacy, charm, and spectacle. He orchestrated celebrations that dazzled foreign envoys, masking his inner obsession with terror beneath a veneer of regal poise. It was in these dualities, terror behind a mask of beauty, blood behind silk tapestries, that his power began to take shape. A darkness that would one day leave a mark on history itself, proving that cruelty could be as deliberate, measured, and artful as any conquest. As the prince matured into adolescence, the scope of his cruelty widened, transforming from hidden experiments to orchestrated spectacles that combined ritual, performance, and fear. Captives from distant campaigns, merchants accused of deceit, and even rebellious members of his own household became unwilling participants in his elaborate displays. He studied their reactions with a scholar's precision, noting the subtle twitch of a lip, the hesitant shift of weight, the barely audible intake of breath, as if the human body itself were a text he was deciphering. His chambers were lined with records, sketches, notes, and diagrams detailing every facet of torment he had witnessed or orchestrated, an obsession that blurred the line between education and malevolence. Advisors and scholars from across the empire attempted to counsel moderation, citing morality, religion, and tradition. But the prince treated their words as curiosities, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the mastery he sought. In public, he retained the mask of charisma and refinement, his laughter ringing through banquet halls, while his eyes betrayed a fascination with unseen suffering. Stories began to circulate among the populace of the nights when no candle dared flicker, when villagers whispered of drums and screams echoing from the palace. Foreign emissaries reported unsettling rituals, prisoners paraded before them, their fate uncertain, as the prince demonstrated both magnanimity and cruelty in measured doses, an unsettling game of power that left witnesses unsure whether to fear or admire. The most chilling aspect of his reign, however, was the personal nature of his cruelty. No longer confined to distant captives, he began selecting victims from those closest to him, servants, guards, and attendants, forcing them into rituals designed to test obedience, loyalty, and psychological resilience. He would watch as friendships fractured under pressure, as trust disintegrated, as fear became a living, breathing entity in the palace. Each act was meticulously staged, ensuring that the lessons of terror were not only seen but felt, etched into memory with precision and intention. Observers noted the prince's methodical patience. He understood that fear was cumulative, that suspense heightened suffering, that the anticipation of pain could break even the strongest spirit, long before any blow was struck. Some historians argue that in this period, the prince's cruelty was a form of political education, a way to forge absolute authority. But those who lived through it saw something darker, an instinctual desire to dominate, to experiment, to watch life unravel under his gaze. Even as he extended his reach across the city and beyond, consolidating alliances and negotiating treaties, the palace itself became a microcosm of terror. Corridors lined with secret doors, chambers hidden behind false walls, spaces designed to isolate, confuse, and unnerve. His closest companions lived in perpetual anxiety, never knowing when a misstep would invite punishment, never certain whether the prince's interest was fleeting or fatal. Modern experts note parallels with psychological conditioning, observing that the prince's techniques prefigured methods used centuries later in authoritarian regimes: the orchestration of fear, the manipulation of perception, the meticulous documentation of behavior. Yet, unlike distant tyrants, his cruelty was intimate, personal, and immediate. It touched every corner of his domain, leaving an imprint on every life he encountered. And while the city outside thrived on trade and culture, inside the palace, nights were a theater of horror, every act a lesson in submission, obedience, and the fragility of human dignity. The prince's fascination with ritual extended beyond punishment. He created ceremonies that blurred the line between sacred tradition and orchestrated terror, mixing ancestral rites with his own inventions, turning every display into a moral and psychological puzzle for his victims. Courtiers and family members alike grew wary, observing the transformation of a gifted young ruler into something resembling a dark legend, a figure whose name would one day be whispered in terror far beyond the walls of his empire. In these years, he honed his abilities with unrelenting precision, mastering the art of fear as others mastered swordplay or diplomacy, until cruelty became not a vice, but an instrument, a tool wielded with skill, patience, and vision, a darkness carefully cultivated, refined, and perfected in the silence of his hidden chambers. By the time the prince reached the height of his power, his reputation had grown into a legend whispered across deserts and mountains, carried in fear and awe alike. Entire towns spoke in hushed tones of the nights when his shadow fell upon them, of merchants who disappeared along trade routes, never to be seen again, of soldiers whose discipline was enforced not only by orders, but by a pervasive dread that followed him like a living thing. The prince's rituals had evolved into intricate ceremonies, blending spectacle, blood, and the illusion of choice. Captives were given fleeting moments to plead, to bargain, to resist, only to discover that every action had already been calculated, every outcome preordained. Observers described scenes that seemed almost surreal: opulent halls bathed in torchlight, victims arranged with ceremonial precision, while the prince moved among them with a grace that belied the terror in his eyes. Scholars later compared his methods to psychological experiments, noting his fascination with human behavior under duress, the way he dissected fear and endurance as if they were threads in a grand tapestry, each strand revealing insight into control, submission, and the fragile veneer of civility. Yet, beyond the calculated cruelty, there was an almost artistic obsession: the arrangement of bodies, the rhythm of punishment, the choreography of despair, as if the palace itself were a stage for his dark genius. Family members who opposed him found their positions eroded by subtle manipulations, whispers, and the quiet elimination of influence, leaving the prince unchallenged in his dominion, both politically and psychologically. Advisors who once counseled him on moderation either vanished or became complicit. Seduced by the precision of his intellect, and the inevitability of his power, while the city itself fell into a strange coexistence of commerce and fear, marvel and terror, loyalty and instinctive dread. Modern historians draw parallels between the prince and other figures of absolute authority, noting that his blend of charisma, intelligence, and systematic cruelty foreshadowed methods used in later centuries to maintain dominion through fear, rather than force alone. Yet what set him apart, and what left an indelible mark on history, was his personal investment in every act of cruelty, his meticulous attention to psychological detail, and the way he transformed violence into ritual, obedience into spectacle, and terror into an art form. In his final years, the prince's palace became a labyrinth of hidden chambers and secret passageways, each designed for observation, isolation, or punishment, reflecting a mind that saw the world as a network of responses, each human interaction a potential site for control. Victims' accounts, passed down through clandestine manuscripts and oral histories, recount a mixture of awe and horror. A prince capable of astonishing generosity in one moment and unspeakable brutality in the next, a ruler whose presence alone could inspire devotion and dread simultaneously. Even after his death, stories of his methods persisted, a cautionary tale of how intellect and cruelty could intertwine to create a shadow that lingered long after the final act. To modern audiences, his life reads as a psychological study, a dark reflection of power untempered by empathy, a chronicle of how the human capacity for cruelty can be cultivated, measured, and perfected over decades. As the dynasty endured, scholars noted that the prince's influence persisted, not only in political structures, but in the collective memory of the empire, a chilling reminder that history remembers not only victories and architecture, but the shadows cast by those who wielded fear as an instrument of authority. His story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human psyche, the allure of power, and the ways in which cruelty can be rationalized, aestheticized, and normalized when cloaked in tradition and spectacle. And while the prince himself has passed into legend, the echoes of his rituals, the fear, the precision, the artistry of terror remain embedded in the stories that survive, reminding us that the most profound horrors are often the ones crafted with intellect, patience, and an unrelenting obsession with the fragility of life. The story of the prince lingers in the shadows of history, a chilling reminder of how intellect, power, and obsession can converge to create unimaginable cruelty. His life was a testament to the terrifying precision with which human suffering can be measured, orchestrated, and transformed into ritual. Yet, beyond the horror, there is a lesson. Even in the grandeur of empire, even amidst wealth and beauty, darkness can flourish when empathy is absent and curiosity is twisted toward domination. As we look back on his legacy, we are forced to confront not only the atrocities themselves, but the fragile nature of human morality, the ease with which fascination can become obsession, and the ways in which power can distort the soul. History, in preserving these accounts, does more than document. It warns, challenges, and compels reflection on our own capacity for understanding, restraint, and compassion. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Share your thoughts on the ways history's darkest figures continue to influence our understanding of power, cruelty, and the human psyche. Because these are lessons that echo far beyond their own time.